Imagine you finally decide to ignore your toddler's bedtime tantrums. You read all the advice, you close the bedroom door, you put in your earplugs, and you just wait.
Right, you just buckle down.
Yeah, exactly. And you logically think the crying would just, well, slowly fade away.
Right.
But instead, on night 3, the tantrum is twice as loud. It lasts 2 hours, and they've started, like, throwing wooden blocks at the door.
Oh, yeah, it escalates fast.
It really does. And your immediate thought is that you failed. The plan is
Wow.
a massive disaster and your kid is just broken. But according to clinical behavioral science, you haven't failed at all. In fact, you're exactly on track.
It feels completely counterintuitive when you're actually in the middle of it. I mean, we are so conditioned to view our own behavior and the behavior of people around us through this highly emotional lens. We think of it as sheer willpower or like personality flaws.
Right, like they're just being stubborn.
Exactly. We assume the toddler is just being defiant, or if we fail a diet, well, we just didn't try hard enough. We attach a massive amount of guilt to all of it.
And that is exactly why I wanted to get into this specific stack of sources today. We are throwing all of those fluffy self-help cliches completely out the window.
Absolutely no slough today.
None. Today on the deep dive, we are looking at a collection of highly technical materials from the world of applied behavior analysis, or ABA. So we've got mock exams, clinical study guides for board-certified behavior analysts, and the official ethics code.
Heavy hitters.
Yeah, real heavy hitters. And our mission today is to uncover the clinical, data-driven reality of how human habits are actually broken. Why do habits come back from the dead? And we want to look at the intense ethical responsibilities of the professionals who manipulate these variables for a living.
It's a huge responsibility.
It is. So think of this deep dive as a shortcut to understanding why your own attempts at changing habits, whether that's managing your kids, training a pet, or dealing with a difficult coworker, might be backfiring completely.
And this stack of materials is illuminating because it strips away all of that emotion. It forces us to look at behavior as an equation. I mean, the core premise we really have to accept from these texts is that every single action we take is simply an operation on our environment.
We do things because they get a result.
Precisely. The environment responds. So if we want to change an action, we can't just rely on wishing or willpower. We have to manipulate the surrounding environment with incredible precision.
So I was looking at the section on a concept called extinction, right?
Mm.
And I made a big assumption. I assumed that if a professional wants to stop a behavior, say a kid whining for a toy, they just stop rewarding it.
Right, just ignore it.
Yeah, they ignore the whining, and the behavior just goes away peacefully. But the clinical data shows the exact opposite happens. The behavior completely explodes. So why does it get worse?
To really understand why it gets worse, we have to look at this brilliant analogy buried in the study guides. It's the broken vending machine.
Oh, I love this one.
It's the best way to explain it. When you put a behavior on extinction, you are essentially breaking a contract that the brain has relied on, sometimes for years. So imagine you walk up to a vending machine in your office. You put in your $2, you press the button for your favorite chips, and literally nothing happens.
Right.
The reinforcement, the snack has been completely removed.
And I certainly don't just, nod understandingly and walk calmly back to my desk.
Nobody does. I mean, what do you actually do? You push the button harder, you push it faster. You might try pushing a whole combination of other buttons.
I'd probably hit the machine.
Exactly. If you're really frustrated, you might physically shake the entire machine. Your brain is basically troubleshooting a glitch. It's saying, wait, pressing this button has always produced a reward in the past.
And the environment must be broken.
Yes. Let me escalate my behavior louder, harder, faster to force the environment to yield the exact result I am expecting.
Wow. So that escalation, like the kid throwing blocks at the bedroom door, that is the clinical concept of an extinction burst.
Spot on.
It's a temporary, massive spike in the frequency or the intensity of the target behavior.
And this right here is a critical juncture in behavior analysis. A clinician absolutely has to prepare stakeholders, the parents, the teachers, the clinical staff for this exact phenomenon.
Because it looks like it's getting worse.
Because it is getting worse momentarily. And if you give in during an extinction burst, it is disastrous. Think about the exam logic here for anyone studying. If you see a temporary increase in frequency or intensity after reinforcement is withheld, you always choose extinction burst. But practically speaking, if you shake the vending machine and a bag of chips finally falls out, you haven't just failed to extinguish the behavior. You have accidentally taught your brain an incredibly dangerous new rule.
Oh man, you taught it that escalating actually works.
Yes. You taught the brain that it just needs to scream louder or throw heavier things to get what it wants. You have actively reinforced a much more intense version of the problem behavior.
That's terrifying.
It is. That is why consistency during an extinction burst is the absolute cornerstone of the entire intervention. If you break, you build a stronger monster.
That makes total sense, but there's another concept in the mock exams that honestly sounds like a complete flaw in human evolution. It's called spontaneous recovery.
Ah, yes. The ghost behavior.
Yeah. The sources describe a scenario where a behavior has been successfully extinguished. So let's say you held the line. You successfully ignored the tantrums. The kid sleeps perfectly for 3 straight months. The brain has seemingly accepted the new rules. And then, out of nowhere, the tantrum reappears. Wait, hold on. If the brain already learned that the vending machine is permanently broken, why would it randomly try it again months later?
It definitely seems like a flaw, but it's actually a highly adaptive evolutionary survival mechanism.
Really? Survival?
Yeah. It is essentially the brain throwing out a lifeline to an old, previously successful strategy just to test the waters. Because in the natural world, the environment changes constantly, right? A fruit tree that was totally barren in winter might actually have apples in the summer. So the brain occasionally just says, hey, I know this button hasn't worked in a long while, but let's press it just once to see if the vending machine has been restocked.
So it's just a test. It's not a relapse.
It is purely a test, and the texts emphasize this heavily. Clinicians must view spontaneous recovery as a completely natural part of the learning process, not a regression. But, and this is a big but, it requires the exact same discipline as the initial extinction.
You have to ignore it again.
Yes. If the behavior is ignored and it contacts zero reinforcement during spontaneous recovery, the brain updates its files, says, nope, still broken, and the behavior disappears again, and usually much faster this time.
Okay, so if punishing a behavior, or even just ignoring it, is this complicated, what happens if it doesn't extinguish properly? Do habits just migrate? Because reading through these mock exams, I noticed this really recurring theme where a behavior is successfully stopped in one setting, but then it creates absolute chaos somewhere else.
Oh, you're talking about the whack-a-mole effect.
Yes, exactly. There's this fascinating example in the text about thumb sucking. These parents are trying to get their young child to stop sucking his thumb, so whenever he does it at home, they use a punishment procedure. They scold him.
And the data shows it works, right?
It works beautifully. Thumb sucking at home drops to 0. The parents think they've completely won. But then they get a call from the preschool. And the teachers report that suddenly, entirely out of nowhere, the child is sucking his thumb constantly in school. Like he's doing it at a rate far higher than he ever did before the parents even intervened.
This is a textbook scenario for a phenomenon known as behavioral contrast. But to really grasp why this happens, we need to unpack the underlying mechanics here.
Please do, because the text uses these terms like motivating operation and schedule of reinforcement, and I really need those broken down. What do those actually mean in plain English?
Let's start with the motivating operation. Think of it as the underlying itch that the behavior is actively trying to scratch. In this case, sucking his thumb provides the child with a sense of soothing or automatic comfort. That need for comfort, the itch has not magically disappeared just because the parents started yelling.
Right, he still needs comfort.
Exactly. The motivation is entirely intact.
Okay, so the itch is the motivating operation. Then what is the schedule of reinforcement?
The schedule is basically the invisible rule book of the environment. It dictates when and where scratching that itch is actually allowed. At home, the rule book has changed drastically. The behavior is now met with punishment. But at school, the rule book remains exactly the same. The teachers are not scolding him.
So he just saves all of his thumb sucking for school.
It's actually more intense than just saving it. Behavioral contrast occurs when a change in one component of a schedule decreases the rate of responding, and the other, unchanged environment, experiences an explosive opposite effect.
Oh, wow.
It is exactly like squeezing a balloon. If you squeeze one end tightly, the air inside doesn't magically disappear.
It just shifts.
Right. The pressure forces it to bulge out massively on the other side. You suppress the behavior in setting A without providing a functional alternative, so the motivation gets bottled up and just detonates in setting B.
That is wild. The obvious question then is, how do you actually kill a habit for good? Because if punishing it just squeezes the balloon and shifts the problem from the living room to the classroom, how do these professionals design interventions that actually last?
That is the ultimate question.
Yeah, how do they ensure a behavior sticks permanently in the real world, long after the therapist is packed up and gone home?
This brings us to probably the most complex and honestly the most important part of the clinical study guides. There is a very specific mandate for clinicians, listed as Task List Concept H.5. It states that a behavior analyst must plan for and attempt to mitigate possible relapse of the target behavior.
So they don't just cross their fingers and hope relapse doesn't happen.
Right.
They actively assume it will,
Yeah.
and they plan for it.
They absolutely have to. And this is a massive area for clinical mistakes.
Yeah.
The profound insight from these texts is that relapse should never, ever be viewed as a failure of the client.
It's not their fault.
Not at all. It is purely a data point. If a behavior relapses, it simply means the current environment is no longer adequately supporting the new desired behavior. The old contingency is just winning out over the new one.
I really want to dig into how they actually do this because the sources talk at length about the difference between contrived reinforcers and natural reinforcers. And there's this scenario where a teacher uses a prize box. They give a student a piece of candy to get them to complete their math worksheet.
Classic setup.
Right. And in the beginning, it works perfectly. The kid is just churning out algebra just to get a piece of chocolate. But the texts strongly warn against relying on this.
Because it is a fragile, completely artificial ecosystem. I tell my clinicians this all the time. If you rely entirely on the candy, which is a contrived reinforcer, you are basically setting a trap for yourself. Eventually, that student is going to look at the teacher and say, well, I am not doing this worksheet if you don't have a Snickers bar today.
And they're right.
Yeah. Based on the exact contingencies the teacher established, the student's logic is absolutely flawless.
So how do you avoid that trap? I mean, how do you practically move them off the candy without losing the behavior?
Mitigating relapse hitting that H.5 mandate requires a carefully planned transition through two phases: maintenance and generalization. To achieve maintenance, you cannot stay on a continuous schedule of reinforcement.
You can't give a reward for every single right answer.
Exactly. You have to implement what is clinically called schedule thinning.
Okay, explain schedule thinning to me. Because how does a therapist actually execute that in a chaotic, real-world environment?
You move systematically from continuous reinforcement to intermittent reinforcement. So in a clinic, an RBT, a registered behavior technician, might start by reinforcing every single correct math problem. That is a fixed ratio of 1.
1 to 1, got it.
But once the skill is acquired, they thin the schedule. They might reinforce every third problem, then maybe every fifth.
So you're just slowly fading out the rewards.
Fading them, yes, but also making them unpredictable. You move to a variable ratio schedule, and this is a clinical power insight right here. This targets the dopamine center of the brain, creating what is essentially the slot machine effect.
Oh, wow. Like gambling.
Exactly like gambling. Why are slot machines so unbelievably addictive? Because you don't win every single time you pull the lever, but you win just enough and unpredictably enough to keep you pulling it over and over again. Intermittent schedules make behaviors highly resistant to extinction.
Because the brain keeps doing the work because the reward might be coming on the very next try.
Right. The brain says, maybe this time. That is deeply psychological, but it's how you build behavioral endurance.
But even if you thin the schedule, you still have the candy involved at some point. How does the behavior survive in the real world where therapists aren't, following you around to high school or your job with a prize box?
That is the ultimate goal of generalization. You must transfer the motivation from those contrived reinforcers, the candy, the tokens, the high fives, from a therapist over to natural reinforcers.
On what's a natural reinforcer?
A natural reinforcer is a consequence that naturally occurs in the environment as a direct result of the behavior itself.
So, for example, the natural reinforcer for doing your math homework is getting a good grade on your report card.
Yeah.
Or maybe feeling a sense of pride. Or simply just avoiding the stress of detention.
Precisely. If the new behavior does not eventually contact natural reinforcement within the client's actual everyday ecosystem, the intervention will inevitably fail. A contrived reinforcer is just a temporary bridge. Mitigating relapse means ensuring the client crosses that bridge and actually finds natural value in the new behavior.
If they don't, the moment the therapist leaves, the behavior just dies.
Exactly. It just disappears.
Having the literal instruction manual for human behavior, knowing how to extinguish habits, squeeze the balloon, and basically manipulate dopamine through schedule thinning, it's a massive responsibility. You're completely rewiring how someone interacts with the world. And that brings us to the BACB Ethics Code.
The ethical guardrails in this profession are incredibly strict, and they absolutely have to be. The technology of behavior change is extremely potent. And historically, before these codes were strictly enforced, vulnerable populations are subjected to some terrible abuses in the name of behavioral compliance.
I can definitely hear parents or even managers listening to this deep dive right now thinking about punishment. Because the clinical guys discuss punishment so objectively, right? Positive punishment, negative punishment. But the ethics code treats it like it's radioactive material.
It is radioactive.
A listener might naturally think, look, I yelled at my kid when they reached for the hot stove and they never touched it again. It worked instantly. So how does an applied behavior analyst respond to that? If punishment works so incredibly fast, why is it ethically the absolute last resort?
This is perhaps the most critical tension in the entire field of behavior analysis. The ethics code, specifically Code 2.15 regarding minimizing risk of behavior change interventions, legally and ethically mandates that behavior analysts prioritize positive reinforcement procedures above all else.
Always start with the carrot.
Always start with the carrot, never the stick. Restrictive or punishment-based procedures are only permitted when an intervention team has documented graph-based proof that less intrusive reinforcement-based means have completely failed.
Even if the stick is faster.
Even if it is faster. The only exception, the absolute only exception, is if the immediate risk of severe harm to the client, for instance, a child with severe self-injurious behavior who is repeatedly hitting their head against a wall, outweighs the inherent risks associated with a punishment procedure.
Because punishment has profound side effects, right? The texts call it behavioral baggage.
It does. It has massive behavioral baggage. The most crucial thing to understand about punishment, and I tell every clinician this, is that it does not teach a new functional skill.
Right, it just stops something.
It only suppresses an existing one. And the side effects are intense. The sources list severe emotional distress and the development of escape or avoidance behaviors.
Meaning the client basically just learns to run away from you.
Yes. If a therapist or a parent becomes a source of punishment, the client's new goal simply becomes avoiding that person entirely. The therapeutic relationship is completely destroyed. Furthermore, there is the huge risk of modeling undesirable behavior.
Oh, I see. If a child sees an adult using, physical force or verbal intimidation to solve a problem, the child learns that intimidation is the correct way to solve problems.
Right.
You are inadvertently teaching them to be punitive to others.
Exactly. You might stop them from touching the stove, but you've taught them that big people yell at small people to get compliance. Therefore, if an intervention absolutely must incorporate a punishment procedure for safety, the oversight is immense. Clinicians have to comply with human rights review committees. They must continually evaluate the data, and if the punishment isn't working rapidly, it must be discontinued immediately. You cannot just leave a punitive measure in place indefinitely.
And to prove how seriously this accountability is taken, there is a super strict rule about documentation in the ethics code. A behavior analyst must retain all of their supervision and client documentation for at least 7 years.
7 years, every piece of paper.
They have to keep every data sheet, every graph, every ethical justification securely stored, ready to be audited by the board or reviewed by a court.
It reflects the sheer gravity of the work we do. You are actively altering the trajectory of a human being's life by manipulating their environment. That 7-year documentation rule ensures that every single choice made by a clinician was conceptually systematic, scientifically validated, and above all, ethically sound. There is zero room for guesswork when you are dealing with someone's autonomy.
Let's take a breath and look back at the ground we have covered, because we have unpacked a lot of really heavy science today. We started by looking at how behaviors fight back against extinction, troubleshooting the broken vending machine through extinction bursts and spontaneous recovery.
Right, the ghost behaviors.
Yeah. We explored the whack-a-mole effect of behavioral contrast, seeing how suppressed habits just migrate to new environments. We dove deep into concept H.5, learning how professionals actively mitigate relapse by thinning schedules and transferring motivation to natural reinforcers. And finally, we examined the heavy ethical burden of this science, prioritizing reinforcement and severely limiting the behavioral baggage of punishment.
It is a profound framework. It really challenges us to stop assuming behavior just happens as a personality, and instead recognize the intricate web of environmental triggers, schedules, and consequences that actively shape everything we do.
I really want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. We spent this entire deep dive talking about behavior analysis in a clinical setting, therapists working with clients or parents working with kids, but these exact same laws of behavior apply to all of us, every single second of the day.
It begs a very uncomfortable question. Given that so much of our behavior is maintained by invisible schedules of reinforcement, well, how much of your daily routine is actually a free-willed choice? Think about the tech companies and social media platforms that use these exact clinical principles.
Oh, wow.
Are you consciously choosing to open that app, or are you just unconsciously responding to the candy and the variable ratio slot machines designed by engineers in Silicon Valley? Are you making a choice, or are you just hitting a lever on a highly optimized schedule of reinforcement?
That is a thought that will absolutely keep you up at night. The next time you try to break a bad habit and you find yourself pushing that vending machine button harder and faster, take a step back. Remember, you aren't weak. You are just experiencing a perfectly natural extinction burst. Take a closer look at the behavioral contingencies operating in your own environment this week. You might be deeply surprised by who or what is actually pulling the strings.
And if this helped you, follow behavioral intelligence, share this episode with another RBT or BCBA who's studying, and leave a comment or review. That's how we grow and how I keep creating high-level content for you. At Amethyst Therapy Services, Inc., we build clinicians, not just test passers. Check us out at www.amethysttherapyservices.com or email us at info@amethysttherapyservices.com.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.